Okay, I'd like to welcome you to our session, Catalysing Capital for First Nation Investments. And we're introducing Caleb Adams, who will be the moderator. And I'll let you, Caleb, introduce your panel.
Thank you.
That's right.
You're welcome to join us.
Come on. Last one. Are you sure? Yeah.
Thank you, everyone, for joining. Can you all hear me? Yeah, great. Thanks for joining us this morning on Gadigal country and, of course, during National Reconciliation Week. My name's Caleb Adams. I'm a director in the ESG and Sustainable Investment team at Evans & Partners. By way of introduction, we're a large wealth management firm with over 35 billion under advice, meaning a lot of our work is with non-for-profits and family offices. That includes a number of First Nations organisations and clients with a strong sense of either purpose or non-financial impact objectives. So often that means clients are interested in exploring how their portfolio relates to First Nations peoples. So personally, I'm a Wali man, a Murray from up in Queensland. So I'm very fortunate in getting to do a lot of that work through our broader sustainable investment capability. I'm joined today by an incredible panel. Kat Henaway, founder of Blacks Capital and a descendant of the Mer and Mill people in Torres Strait. Nigel Brown, CEO of Aboriginal Investment NT, in the Larrakia and Walna, man. And Adam Fletcher, Associate Director of Indigenous Banking and Community NAB, and a green guy and Wanneroo.
Spot on.
So thank you for joining us today. Before I hand over to the panel, I will provide a little bit of context first behind the discussion and I guess where we're coming from. So the discussion stems from a broader piece of work that the RIA First Nations Rights Working Group has been doing. Some research with a range of First Nations investment and community leaders and industry professionals more broadly to understand the state of the sector and the market. While we were hoping to focus on the deployment of capital and mechanisms to fast-track that, a lot of the conversations ended up landing further upstream, suggesting that there are some really important enabling aspects that we need to address before trying to replicate and scale the deployment piece of the conversation. So those are things like the representation of First Peoples in investment markets and the chronic underrepresentation in the sector, what that means from a capability point of view, through to the alignment of systems, processes and structures to enable the amplification of really important issues. So the point of the conversation today was hopefully to extend that conversation into that deployment piece by highlighting people and organisations that are at the leading edge of that work. Just very quickly, before we go further, some contextual comments as well from that research to help frame the conversation too. So firstly, what do we mean by First Nations investment markets? So there are probably three ways that we would define it. So firstly is the representation of Indigenous asset owners in investment markets, i.e. are Indigenous organisations and communities investing their capital, and is the industry fit for purpose to service their needs? The second is around alignment, so things like Dwyer and Inland principles, which many of you may have heard about, or the work of First Nations equity partners in putting forward research to align investments in non-Indigenous outcomes and non-Indigenous companies, aligning that with the rights and priorities of First Peoples. And the third one, which again we're hoping to talk about today, is about investment in First Nations outcomes and communities. So empowering self-determination and prosperity through access to capital. The second point of clarification is why that matters to investors. So there's an impact lens that many may take, so recognising conversations around justice or purpose and trying to empower through that lens, but also an angle around realising the economic potential from an investment point of view. When we think about the Indigenous estate, for example, 20% of Australia's land mass is controlled and owned by Indigenous peoples. A further 70% of Australian, or 70% in total, has other forms of Indigenous rights, native title, and co-management arrangements. So there are some really distinct strengths as well that we don't see properly engaged through capital markets and investors, and an opportunity that we can try and engage. So those are some contextual comments. We'll get started now with the discussion. So I might start with yourself, Nigel. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about your work in Aboriginal Investment NT, in particular why the structure and approach is important?
Yeah, thanks, Caleb. I'll start by acknowledging the country we're on. Niliark Bachiganyam, Gangwa Goyelwa Gadigal. In my language, Larrakia language, you've arrived, it's good to see you, this is Gadigal country. We talk and have talked a lot about place these last 2 days. It's always important to acknowledge where we are. I've been the CEO of Aboriginal Investment Northern Territory for 3 months, and I've been telling people it's a bit like drinking out of a fire hydrant. Hopefully the water pressure will go down soon. Prior to that, I spent 13 years as the CEO for Larrakia Development Corporation in Darwin, on my country, looking after my people, but now I have a much wider remit, making sure that across the 1.4 million square kilometres of Northern Territory, all of our Aboriginal communities get the same opportunity to do the things they need to do for the future of their communities and, most importantly, their children. The way that the investment corporation was structured is unique. It's the only kind, it's one of a kind in the country at the moment. We are an Aboriginal organisation created by Aboriginal people across the Northern Territory, with Aboriginal money, most importantly, for the purposes of the work that we're doing, working in our Aboriginal communities to try to affect change. That mandate is reinforced by the fact that we're an independent statutory body under the Aboriginal Land Rights Act. We have a very clear mandate to encourage, probably rather dryly, self-management and self-sufficiency of communities economically, but also to encourage the social and cultural well-being of our communities. It's an opportunity which we're running with now. The corporation's been established just on 2 years. We have a focus on 2 streams. One is grant funding for Aboriginal businesses to start and to grow, and also an investment stream that some of you may know, a fellow by the name of Brian Wyborn, my Chief Investment Officer, who's now working on the nation building part of the work that we're doing, looking at the much larger scale projects that we can co-design with traditional owners. And it's that co-design, it's that participation, and essentially getting our direction from traditional owners, which is the basis upon which how we go about our business. So if we are doing what has been done forever, and that is outsiders coming into communities telling people what's right for them, then we're not doing our job properly. And it's more a long-term, slow burn process. You think about what's happened in this country since Captain Cook came along, somewhere around here. It is generational. We are trying to create a legacy for people in the Northern Territory.
Thank you.
Amazing.
Kat, do you want to tell us a little bit more about your work and the insights that you have having worked with a number of, or many Indigenous businesses, entrepreneurs and raising capital for them?
Thank you, Caleb. Yes, I'm Kat Henaway. As Caleb said, I'm a descendant of the Mer and Moor peoples of the Torres Strait Islands, and I've been living in Sydney on and off for 30 years. I started Blacks Capital in about 2019, and the reason we started was because I had been working in the Indigenous Entrepreneurs Fund. It was a $90 million fund issued by Nigel Scullion. He was the Minister for Indigenous Affairs at the time. And what they wanted to do, of course, was grow the Indigenous business sector and help Indigenous businesses access capital from the fund. I was a New South Wales consultant, so I had the great pleasure of, flying around the state of New South Wales and helping Indigenous businesses develop their business plans and access and write the grant applications to access funding. So that work informed why we established Blacks Capital. We wanted to continue providing professional services to Indigenous businesses because we could see that there was a really great need for it, for culturally safe professional services delivery. So for the first 5 years in Blacks Capital, we continued to deliver culturally safe professional services to Indigenous businesses, and over that time we helped Indigenous businesses unlock or access up to $45 million in capital. And that is mostly, because we work with a lot of SMEs, it's mostly through tenders, contracts, grants, and so that has been the language of the work we've been doing. Just a couple of years ago, we decided that we wanted to look at how do we scale, how do we expand the work that we do, and we partnered with another company. Excuse me, I'm just going to turn my phone on silent. We partnered with another company to look at capital raising for Indigenous projects. So that work has taken us down this investment path. And it's been really interesting moving into this new area because it's very, very new. I think the thing that we have to remember is that the Indigenous business sector is still very, very young. It's only been around, officially been around for about 15 years. So the language of scaling and the language of investment for SMEs is really a new concept. So it's been quite challenging, but really, really very exciting to be working in this space.
Thank you. Before I bring yourself in, Adam, I'll just remind everyone that we do have the Slido as well. We'll bring in some questions from the audience towards the end or throughout, so please make sure you're using that. I think it's also on the back of your lanyard as well if you need. But over to yourself now, Adam. Can you tell us a bit more about your work at NAB and why that's important for a major bank?
Definitely. And I also bring acknowledgement of country from my elders and ancestors. My language, Wanneroo, is in a state of revitalisation, so I'll just do a brief acknowledgement as well. Nian Marangku Paran Wian, Garigal, Mirmalikan Pariani, Parankupa, Yachan Yang, Murung Wian, Yarankai, Parankai, Yokaikal, Pangaikal, Yachan Kumpakal. So in the language of our ancestors, we acknowledge the Gadigal people, traditional keepers of this land, and we pay respects to elders past and present. So in terms of my role at NAB and what we've been focusing on, so we're a bank, so we're a little bit different to many of you in the audience here today. We do have an investment arm, which is JB Ware, but NAB, like a lot of corporates, has had a reconciliation action plan since, well, for us, 2008. And we were an early leader in reconciliation. We made good strides in employment, good strides into supply diversity, for example, and we did commission a lot of research that helped sort of colour in some gaps of knowledge, so financial literacy, financial inclusion and things like that. We also launched a partnership with Good Shepherd Microfinance, which addressed an observed gap when we did that research, which was that there wasn't affordable finance for people that were in trouble. And a lot of Aboriginal people and communities are in that lower socioeconomic band, and many of them have been victims to predatory lending. So we offer no interest loans and low interest loans to help address those gaps. We also pioneered micro enterprise lending, which helped capitalise businesses, but it was capped at about $25,000. In 2019, we had a strategy shift where we wanted to look more into social impact, and that's probably where I come into the picture a little bit more. And so there was an idea of what is NAB's core strength, what are we as a business, and the recognition was that at our core, despite all the other great things we do, we're a relationship business, particularly relationship business banking, which is our bread and butter, but we believe relationship banking is the way forward, and that's a key strength of ours. So we decided to apply that to our reconciliation journey. And so we launched an Indigenous business strategy, which I was asked to help shape. And that started with talking to customers, talking to bankers, understanding where both sides were at culturally, in terms of knowledge, even networks and connections. And what we found when we did that research was that Indigenous people often don't know what the role of a bank is. And later on, what we found out is they probably didn't even understand a lot of the roles of capital and equity investment as well. And on the other side, our bankers didn't have access to the networks. They didn't know where these Indigenous entrepreneurs were starting their business and how to find them. And so we launched a team of national specialists, which I'm part of now. And our job is to understand the local context, the local opportunities, the local legislation. Each state has their own constructs. New South Wales land councils are very different to the Northern Territory land councils, for example. Understand those differences and the opportunities, and act as a cultural bridge between both sides. So we work alongside our banking colleagues, we introduce and refer deals to them, and we also work with external partners. So the later stage of that journey really is just recognising that often the bank is the last stage of funding for a business. You know, you've already started your business, you've got your operations up and running, you've probably sought equity investment, and many of our customers were coming to us with a lot of those earlier stages of the capital chain, either partially complete or incomplete, or weren't informed about what they needed. And what that meant for us was we weren't able to come to the party and offer, prudent debt solutions to help support that next stage of growth. So that really got us interested in who can we partner with, what can we do more, and also I didn't want to duplicate or create anything new. I don't know if you've ever worked at a large corporate, but there's always a tendency to try and solve every problem yourself. And I was mindful that from a self-determination perspective, I'm sure Indigenous people are already working towards solving some of these opportunities, and we needed to pitch in and support them. So that was why we've sort of stepped out in this way.
Yeah, thank you. And so one of the things we hear a lot about when we're talking about capital and raising capital, or the deployment of capital to First Nations outcomes, is the role of fund managers and the challenges around access to capital in that sort of space. We certainly see it from a wealth management perspective. Kat, I'm sure you can speak to it as well. But just sticking with yourself, Adam, I'm curious to hear how NAB has sort of seen its role in that space as a catalyst and an anchor in some ways as well. Any examples you want to share?
Yeah, so there's a few examples, but probably the most applicable in this group is touching on what I said earlier. So a lot of Indigenous groups or people have access to land through native title processes. They may even have operating businesses that run alongside their cultural interests. So you'll see up north there's a lot of cattle operations where there'll be cattle stations operating on Indigenous owned or controlled land. But the practical reality is that a lot of that land that's been returned to traditional owners is usually not the most high quality farming land. It's what's left over. The high quality farming land has already been given or sold for leases or freehold title to other parties. And so they're trying to operate their business in a way that really isn't economically viable or sustainable or doesn't support good growth. And so we were approached by an external investment group who were interested in sort of solving that challenge, which is how can they help make the Indigenous estate more productive. And what they found was if you could purchase some of that higher value freehold land, the Indigenous estate could basically grow and raise cattle early and then move their cattle to be finished in a higher, more productive land. And they could share the upside benefit of that higher productivity. And so the deal is called a New Harvest. And what is unusual is banks typically don't take equity investment positions in things like this. And recognising our role in the ecosystem, we wanted to take a leading position there. So we actually pledged $10 million as a cornerstone investor in that package back in 2023. And the goal there is really just to enable that fund to seek further investment, to sort of prove that we've had a look at it and there's good opportunity here. And then ideally for us, what we'd love to see is Indigenous owners partnering up with this fund, benefiting from the shared, benefit the productivity gains. And then for us, we can also support the Indigenous estate on the other side. So if they need capital investment in terms of fencing, farming equipment, whatever it might take to help continue that productivity journey, we're on hand, we're ready, and we also know that there's like a productive offtake and a good product at the end of the day. So we're just trying to help encourage that ecosystem to evolve to solve some of those challenges that we've observed up north.
It's a great point on collaboration, which we'll try and get back to later in the session as well. We've had our first question come through on Slido, which is a subtle reminder to keep using that for those out there. But I might get Kat and Nigel, your thoughts on this as well. Pretty close to the question I was going to ask you next, Kat. So what are some of the current examples of capacity and capability work to bridge the gap between community needs and aspirations and capital investment decisions? Do you have any comments on that work?
So a lot of the work we do is one-on-one directly with Indigenous SMEs. And so it's all about capability building for small business owners. So we do a lot of mentoring, coaching, developing growth strategies with businesses, helping them to access, what they're accustomed to in terms of business capital, which is loans, grants. But more recently, we've been approached, certainly in the last couple of years, we've been approached by many SMEs about this new language around capital raising and investments and what that looks like. There's a lot of Indigenous businesses that I work with that have actually been around for 10 or more years. They're very capable business owners. They've built significant wealth in their own businesses. And many of them are looking for or asking for, what is the next step? Where do we go from here? And so that leads into a conversation around investment. And the really interesting thing is that, as I said before, because the sector is still quite new, quite young, there has been a dearth of programs, scaling programs, incubators, accelerators for Indigenous business owners. And so the language around investments is very, very new to a lot of Indigenous SMEs. So we do a lot of education around, okay, so what does scaling look like, and what constitutes pre-seed investment? What is seed? What does Series A look like? And so a lot of education for business owners around the language of scaling. So yeah, that's quite a lot of the work we do nowadays.
What about yourself, Nigel? What does capacity building look like in your work?
Yeah, basically what Kat said. In addition to that, one of the things which Aboriginal Investment Northern Territory probably doesn't do at the moment too well is the mentoring side. We get the grants, we give out the money, and then we wish people well. That's something that we need to import into our business model. For me, it's a pretty simple and fundamental point. Aboriginal communities around not only the Territory but Australia are playing catch up. It's not for a lack of ambition. It's not for a lack of capability. It has everything to do with the history of what Aboriginal people and communities have had to put up with forever and a day. So the job that we're trying to do at AINT is to inject that equity back into the lives of the people that we work for. But, in terms of practical applications and outcomes, which is the stuff that I really enjoy, and a message for people here today is don't just think about a project that you can invest in that you can make money from and that you can hand out to your shareholders and everybody gets a slap on the back. Look at the investment in the capacity of Aboriginal communities. Whether it's looking at scholarships for kids to go through at the primary school level to schools that they might otherwise not have a chance to go to, whether it's at the tertiary level to help people get that Bachelor of Business or Commerce or Economics, or sort of more workable things like medicine. We need definitely more doctors out there. Employing people, you know, none of this stuff is groundbreaking. None of this stuff is, you know, new. There you go. Talking about groundbreaking. And, you know, there are so many different ways that, you know, I don't know what gets you out of bed in the morning. Is it a $1 million deal, a $10 million deal, or a $100 million deal? But there are so many different things you can do in different ways. Look at your supplier list. The people that provide your printing paper, your cleaners, the people that distribute wholesale alcohol, whatever it might be, to keep those fridges stocked. There are changes you can make this afternoon if you really wanted to. And all it boils down to really is appetite. What do you want to do individually and collectively to help Aboriginal business, which will help Aboriginal communities?
Thank you. Reflecting on it as well, I think capacity building, we've seen a lot of programs that are really well established out there in a social context, but I think it's really important that we don't think about the investment side as isolated as well, and that when we are building new solutions, new approaches, that we don't forget that in the design of investment vehicles and the unique context in which that's operating. It's also not something that's unique to First Nations investment markets. We see venture funds that their special source is the incubator program or the academic institution that they're associated with. So I think there's similarities that are pretty well known, that aren't, you know, they're not abstract things around how we get really good ideas, really good people in front of investors and compatible with. So I think it's an important thing to think about when we're designing new approaches and thinking about what best practice looks like. But shifting to collaboration briefly, I think one of the things we're thinking about or discussing before this panel was some of the strengths. We mentioned the Indigenous estate before. I think there are some really interesting comparisons with Canada as well. If we think about what the discourse in Australia has largely been centred on First Nations businesses, the relationship with the Indigenous procurement policy setting at a government and private sector level. And it's meant rather individualistic approaches in terms of what we're investing in, who we're investing in, and perhaps when we're thinking about the investors, a niche and nascent market, and a lot of family offices potentially engaging individually. So there's a lot of individual approaches on either side. In Canada, there's really interesting models emerging that are scalable, and they're collaborative, both in terms of the investors and the investees, with collaboration between tribal governments and First Nations. They're able to then raise billions of dollars in debt with respectable credit ratings and have a really strong relationship with markets and institutional investors. There's some really interesting models around the packaging of royalty commitments into a listed vehicle to leverage that for economic capability. Some really cool innovation happening, but I think a lot of it stems from collaboration. So interested to hear your thoughts on what that looks like in the Australian context as an important part of growing this market as well. Kat, potentially starting yourself.
Yeah, we're hearing quite a lot more from investors and grantees, grant makers, around this about this conversation around growing the Indigenous investment ecosystem. And so a lot of people are looking at this. We're seeing, quite a few new funds emerging, some venture capital funds specifically targeting Indigenous entrepreneurs, the AINT fund that Nigel leads. This is really quite groundbreaking, very, very inspiring and new. The longer we're in this space, the more we start to see some really amazing Indigenous-led funds and initiatives. So in terms of collaboration, I think what we've spoken a lot about is the need for stakeholders in the sector now, particularly those interested in investments, to come together and co-design what the Indigenous investment roadmap looks like for an entrepreneur. Because unless we co-design something that works for the Australian investment sector, as well as something that is appropriate and culturally safe for Indigenous investees, there is potential for us to go barging down this road of investments and creating more harm than good. So what I would like to see is stakeholders coming together and co-designing a culturally appropriate roadmap for Indigenous investments.
Nigel, do you have any thoughts on that as well, as a large asset owner?
Yeah, been to Canada a few times. It's pretty cold over there. They're doing a lot of good things. There's a lot of shared history there, obviously. They do have something we don't, in the form of treaty. However, speaking to and meeting with First Nations mob across the western part of Canada, that's certainly not, as good as it sounds. And over many, many years of broken promises, they're still working at it as well. But there's a lot that we can take inspiration from. I love the community-based and regional-based banking institutions that they have that are First Nations owned and led. Banks that are supported by their communities and have a lower default rate than the mainstream banks over there because the community supports their banking system and the money that it controls. But I also know that having met people who've worked in that system, that it's not perfect and always needs work as well. The collaboration side of things that we're looking at the moment, from a territory perspective, as I said, the AINT's only been stood up for the last 2 years. In truth, our investment piece has only really started to gain traction in the last 3 months. Before I was the CEO, the CIO was in my role, acting, waiting for me to get on boarded. So we are very much open to discussions with any investment groups or foundations that have interest in the Northern Territory. And it's, not just looking at the private market, of course. I mean, we're in discussion with Indigenous Business Australia, the North Australia Infrastructure Fund, Indigenous Land and Sea Corporation. So looking at those other statutory bodies to help provide the back of house strength to support, again, the primary focus of everything we do, which is our communities. So, call it blended finance, call it what you will. We will do whatever we need to do to achieve our mandate, informed by, again, the values that we hold true to ourselves as Aboriginal people in the top end and the centre.
I think it's from a collaboration. I think I work for a large bank, and so we're very centralised. We've got our branches and our bankers across Australia, but a lot of our decision making happens in capital cities, Sydney, Melbourne. I think that's at odds with most communities, but particularly Indigenous communities. We're place-based people, and we need to start making and empowering place-based decisions. the touch point on the individual business owners succeeding and growing, that's really important. But I think that if that happens in isolation from collective uplift from the rest of the community, or cross-pollination of those skills into community service delivery and other arms that help empower that community, you're kind of lifting one part and the rest of the tent's kind of falling down. So one great model I've seen recently, I had Michael Ingray, who is the current CEO for Indigenous Empowered Communities, and I'm not promoting their model specifically. There's all kinds of models that are being trialled and developed and shaped and grown across the country. And it's basically a place-based decision-making and funding body. It's seeking, rather than having independent service delivery arms, land councils, all these different bodies trying to independently pitch for funding to support social development programs, or even business or economic development objectives, they're actually kind of coming together as a group and agreeing priorities and then putting forward a joint application and working actively with government, but also more importantly now, investors, banks, financiers, all these other groups of people to try and create that blended finance structure that meets a collective outcome. And even just by doing that act, you're creating a new set of skills within those people, because you might have a health service operator who's never spoken to an investor or tried to prepare a pitch before, being part of a group who are actively pitching to seek funding, and they're able to bring that skill set back into their organisation. So looking for some of those novel groups and considering how can we support the growth and the proliferation of those approaches is a really important way to go.
Yeah, thank you. We're running out of time, so I might move towards closing call to action, but just to frame that as well, I think there were some points yesterday morning in the session with Paul and Tim that stuck with me, and I don't think we were going to match the energy of that session today. Paul's points around finding or designing a political economy for the 21st century, I think that resonates with the context and the discussion that we're having here today, but also Tim's points around challenging that, recognising that approaches need to resonate with a diverse audience and that we need to ensure durable approaches. I think they're really important things to remember. That means thinking about Indigenous investments not as an asset class but as a theme. We need to recognise that within that there are infrastructure projects, direct business lending, venture capital, many different types of investment that require specialist expertise, but also need to remain grounded and centred in community values and principles. I think for me that goes back to the diverse set of skills in organisations that are needed to create and drive that. So I might use that as framing in terms of those actors to make use of the last question here as well, in terms of indicators that you look for in investors and potentially partners when engaging. If you were to think about that in terms of a call to action to prospective partners in the audience, what does that look like? And Adam, I might ask you to flip it as well, and what does that look like for NAB in terms of how you think about you yourself as a partner? What do you aspire to be like?
I'll apply both ways. I think patience and adaptability is what we're looking for. If you're too structured and strict in what your role is or how you're going to play, I think it can be challenging because it's an evolving space, and so there might be more support provided. So we're trying to do that ourselves. And if I'm looking at a deal structure where there's perhaps an inflexible partner, I'd be concerned. So that's what I'd encourage: flexibility and being adaptable to what's going on. Yeah.
Thanks. Nigel, call to action for you?
Yeah, look, I go back to what I said about capacity building and doing a lot of the small things that will over time help build a bigger picture and opportunity for mob. In relation to collaboration, we've got a pretty good spider sense, so we can see the bad actors coming from a mile away. And in places like the Territory where the bush telegraph is quicker than the internet,
Yep.
you will end up falling on your face if your intentions are not pure or close to pure, can I say. Really, it's about, don't come to us talking about MOUs. Don't come to us talking about reconciliation action plans. Come to us talking about contracts, enforceable agreements, reciprocal agreements. If you want to collaborate and have a leg up on your Aboriginal business partner, then what you're doing and what you're wanting to achieve is for you and your stakeholders, your shareholders only. And that is business, I suppose. But what we are trying to do and the way that we will operate with our Aboriginal communities in the Territory is to steer them away from people who simply want to make a quick buck. So it might not be for all investors in the room. It might be foundations that have a much longer term view of engagement. But like I said, the hairs on the back of your neck stand up pretty quickly when collaborators who actually don't want to collaborate come along. We're getting signs here.
Yeah. Time to wrap up, I guess. Kat, final comments?
Yeah, I agree with what Adam and Nigel have said, and for me, it always boils down to cultural safety. We started Blacks Capital because we wanted to deliver culturally safe professional services to our mob, and we always lead with that. So if you're looking to invest in Indigenous businesses, consider your own knowledge around cultural safety. If you don't understand cultural safety, then do a course, do some education, so that when you do come to work with Indigenous businesses, you come prepared and aware of the way that your organisation or you may need to be flexible in terms of understanding how to work with Indigenous businesses.
Thank you. We'll close it there, but I'll just give a little plug for another session happening this afternoon, which looks at more of that institutional alignment piece around investing with elevated First Nations rights and priorities, which could be of interest to those of you in the room. So that's happening this afternoon as well. Otherwise, thank you, and please join me in thanking the panel today.